That's Suzanne. Yeah, if you can do the recording, great. Thank you very much. Okay, and we'll get started with Ben and Katherine. Take it away. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Right, I'm just going to share my presentation from the beginning. Are we there? Okay, can everyone see that? Great. Okay, really nice to be here, and thanks for the organisers for inviting us. So we're going to approach the public of the academic library, and we're going to do this in 3 sort of core sections. So firstly, we're sort of switching methodologies across the way. So we hope to sort of open up some conversations about how we even kind of assess and access these conversations. I'll just stop my video as well. So firstly, I'm going to give a historical overview of the wider trajectories of English HE over the last century or so. Then Ben will present some LAS literature on the subject, and also a survey that we recently carried out into the current state of play for public access to academic libraries. Then finally, I'll talk about my ethnography of the Hive, which is one joint use library in Worcester, which I studied as part of a PhD, which I recently finished, and was in sociology. And then we'll end by sort of opening up some provocations for ways we might think differently about publicness and academic libraries. There's a whistle stop tour around a few different things. There we go. So across these sections, we approach the academic library as fundamentally interconnected with wider questions of public education, public space, and public knowledge. We see the library as mediating 2 important relationships, that between the university going public and their knowledges inside the library, but also that between the university and the non-university going public. So it's both inward facing and outward facing, and has a function and a sort of functional and symbolic complexion. Beyond the immediate context of the university campus, the academic library sits within a wider ecology of public institutions, which include universities, but which also include public libraries, council services, public spaces, etc. And though we often conceive of these, or they are conceived of differently, separately, and in almost siloed conversations, these elements are actually, or we want to approach them as relational and mutually contingent, and that they contribute to an overall culture of public space, education, and knowledge. So this kind of Venn diagram sort of attempt to sort of visualize the potential of the academic library as sort of bridging the university with its wider community. So now I'm just going to point to a few landmark changes in the university sector and the way that they relate to the library. So by pre-Robbins, we're really talking about the development of the Civic University movement at the turn of the 20th century. So prior to this, there was some 400 years of very ancient and elite education, basically just Oxbridge. And although this comes with caveats and they were still elite, the Civic University movement, which included Liverpool, which is the one I just put on the slide, came about with this sort of shift in thinking about the purposes of higher learning, and precipitated a closer linkage between the local community, its industrial needs, and academia. The civic universities really came out of these localities. The libraries themselves came out of a pooling of pre-existing voluntaristic learned society libraries, pre-existing colleges, and local patronages. So in terms of the practicalities of the libraries, they were also sort of founded through this kind of cooperation between small learned societies and sharing kind of resources and staff. So the Robbins report of 1963 heralded another big innovation in the university trajectory, and there were many new universities founded off the back of it, including Warwick, which I've included there. So also through Robbins, HE became systematized for the first time. There was more government involvement, but also a kind of wider principle of engagement, again with the sort of caveats of them still being elite. This period also saw the growth of Sconnell, the establishment of the British Library and the Public Libraries Act of 1964. So again, this kind of mutual ecology of public education. The final sort of moment of expansion came in '92 with the conversion of polytechnic colleges to university status, disrupting the field again and bringing more people into the university system while maintaining government grants and the related public knowledge institutions. So really this sort of all shows an imperfect and perhaps uneven, but nevertheless kind of expanding field of academic knowledge with the library in the middle of it. But where are we now? So we probably know this pretty well. So with the Brown Review of 2010 and then the Higher Education Research Act of 2017, we can see publicness of academic knowledge in contraction again. So although student numbers may be rising exponentially, the overall ecology of public knowledge has contracted. The increasing of individualised student fees and the reduction of central government funding has kind of coincided with what's happened in the wider public with austerity, and so HE is reformulated from a public good towards an individualised product. So that was a quick historical overview, and now with that in mind, we're going to sort of drill down into some more of the specifics of the state of play in the library sector now.
Thanks, Katherine. So yeah, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the public library access to academic libraries in LIS literature. So there's very little actually written on this topic, but where we can start to get at the question is from literature on engagement, outreach, publicity, as well as literature on collaboration and cooperation. So outreach is a well-debated topic in library and information science. This has a long history, which, as Katherine mentions, is tied up in the origins of many academic libraries in England and their early close relationship to the public libraries. In a meta-commentary on the concept, Diaz provides quite a general but robust definition. For our purpose, the key aspects of it are that outreach is typically implemented periodically throughout the year, is primarily targeted to current students and faculty, and is often designed to support shared institutional goals such as lifelong learning, cultural awareness, student engagement, and community engagement. The cyclical and internally focused nature of much outreach or engagement work in LIS reveals the limits of where the imagined user base or community of the library resides. While here we are advocating for a more expansive view, it is worth noting though that even in this idea of internal outreach, it contains within it the idea that although the library is in theory a service available to all, it is in fact more used and more geared up to support a certain kind of user. The more relevant outreach for our purposes is what we might call external outreach, that is, to the non-university affiliated users, the public. Schneider has a nice formulation for thinking about this kind of outreach, which is in relation to where the desire stems from. Is it from without? Are there groups or institutions expressing interest in wanting to use the library? Or is it from within? Is there some ethic or mission which the library itself has devised, which means access should be given? There are some instances of state-level mandates for public access to academic libraries, such as in the state of Hawaii in the United States. We can also think here of places in which there are formal relationships between universities and councils for library service provision, such as in Worcester, Kingston, and Southend. More generally, there often exists some kind of relationship between public and academic libraries via an access group or forum through which some degree of reciprocal service can be provided. Other external institutions may form relationships with academic libraries to get access for their members. Here we can think of local schools and colleges, business forums, civil society groups, and political organisations. Just what kind of access they might get, though, is a question we will come to. Where an internal mandate or mission does exist, it can vary widely in what it actually looks like on the ground or feeds into policy. In many cases, the desire to do outreach or engagement at a university level is about showing the wider public what has been achieved by the university workers, be this in the form of exhibitions or public lectures. It's much more rare to actually open the university up to those who are not enrolled. Despite this and the commodification and marketisation of education mentioned above, we can see librarians in a number of different institutions successfully arguing for and enacting radically different approaches that not only let the wider public in, but also take the service out to them, which we'll come to see in the example from Worcester later. Finally, there is a literature that I will dub "Public is Bad." Much of this work argues that the academic library, by providing too much access to the public, takes away from the support that should be going to public libraries, or in some cases, school libraries. Ford and Lickness state that libraries cannot be all things to all people. I'm sure there's a lot more literature we yet to find on this topic, and we are slowly ascertaining exactly where to look for it. However, for now, we'll move on to talk about the survey we conducted to look at present-day library policy at English academic libraries. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So one way of getting at some of the questions we were trying to answer, we decided, was through conducting a survey. This was to try and get a sense of what approaches were taken by academic libraries to public access, and to see if different approaches could be said to correspond or even correlate with the specific nature of each university. Here we have chosen to focus on English institutions, as education policy is devolved in the rest of the UK, and of specifically degree awarding bodies. We chose 25 universities to investigate and try to make this as representative a sample as possible of all 106 degree awarding bodies in England. As you can imagine, there are many ways to categorise universities, and without wanting to get into the weeds, we chose to use a slightly altered scheme divided by Watson, which breaks universities down into 14 different categories. So for each of the 25 universities, we combined data available from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, hereafter HESA, with publicly available information on access, engagement, and conceptions of community from the universities themselves. This was in some instances quite difficult to come by because of COVID. As is completely understandable, many universities have changed their policies in light of lockdown, and in some instances, this has also involved taking down information or hiding information from their websites. To get around this, we made some use of the Wayback Machine to see what policies were in place in more normal times. In these instances, of course, the information is by its very nature not up to date, but hopefully gives a sense of the approach said universities have chosen to take. As a side note here, it'll be interesting to see how COVID affects access rights and engagement over the next few years. All the changes and restrictions that have been put in place remain. So from the HESA, we were able to get basic information such as number of students, financial data such as cash flow statements, as well as what they refer to as social, community, and cultural engagement. And when looking at freely available information from the websites, we were interested in finding out who can access, what can be accessed, and how can you gain access. Finally, we furnished all this with some city or regional metrics, such as the population of the settlement in which the university sits, and a sense of the public library cuts in the city or county, which we garnered from the excellent publiclibrariesnews.com. Next slide, please. So to the survey itself. So just to say, this is still very much a work in progress, and so all conclusions drawn will be quite tentative at this point. However, there seems to be an incredible degree of uniformity in approach across all the surveyed institutions. In nearly every case, there is no unrestricted walk-in access to the public. In some cases, you can simply sign in on the day and get reference access, and then perhaps pay a fee to borrow, while in others, this fee must be paid up front even to get in the building. In others, again, there is no access for anyone not on a predefined list of possible members. 11 of the 25 institutions allowed any user to obtain reference access either by just signing in and showing ID or by completing a free registration form. Of the remaining 14, access could be gained via payment and or via sponsorship from someone at the university. Only one institution did not allow any public access irrespective of payment or credentials. It is a similar picture when it comes to accessing electronic resources. Again, 14 of the surveyed institutions allowed access to electronic resources from dedicated terminals with some restrictions. The remaining 11 allowed no access at all. This, at least to me, is a surprising variation. And although I assume it is relation to some specific license arrangements, it does seem strange, as there doesn't seem to be any other correlating factor as to why, if two academic libraries both allow reference access or borrowing access, one will completely restrict electronic resource access. Another question is what categories the libraries themselves divided users into and what privilege each user group was afforded. Beyond staff and students, there is an enormous range of other potential user groups for which policies exist. In this survey, we focused on external members, i.e. ordinary members of the public, with no known characteristics to get a baseline sense of what is available. However, the kinds of users the library explicitly considers, we think, is revealing of broader understandings of the communities to whom the library might be important and the other institutions in which the academic library is engaged. The first and most common group considered beyond the university and staff themselves are students and staff from other universities or those with former association to the university. In every instance where some access was given, even more access was given if you were at another institution via Sconnell or an alumni. Next, it is others involved in education, so school or college students. A number of libraries have formal relations with so-called partner colleges. At these institutions, borrowing access to the university library tends to be free upon some form of registration. Finally, a few institutions explicitly consider users from other parts of the public sector ecosystem in the town or city. At one institution, current or former employees of the council can get free borrowing access, along with NHS workers. At another, public library users can be referred to get free access. And at another again, those who work in care will be given free access. A few of the surveyed libraries now have mixed use areas which are open to anyone, though the vast majority do not. Likewise, a number of academic libraries are now integrated with public library provision in their towns, the University of Worcester, which Katherine will discuss shortly, as well as the libraries at Kingston and the University of Essex Southend campus. At this stage, we haven't found any strong correlation between any of the indicated variables on screen, so population of city versus number of students, university approach to public engagement, financial indicators of public library cuts, and the amount of public access available. However, there does seem to be some relationship between the type of institution and its overall approach. We have found that the civic universities and the so-called new universities, i.e. post-2004, are those which are most likely to provide public access. So having considered this question at a very broad level, we would now like to look at one specific example of public access to the academic library in the Hive at Worcester.
Great. Okay, so gear change again in terms of methodology and scope. So I'm going to get into a bit of my PhD research, which took place at the Hive in Worcester, which was part of a big ethnography over several years. And so we haven't got time to thoroughly explain the methodology or the full scope of the thesis, but I'm just going to draw out a few themes which speak directly to the issue of public engagement in the university. So some background to the Hive for anyone who doesn't know. The Hive is a collaborative, integrated, joint-use library in Worcester. It's a partnership between the University of Worcester and Worcester's local authority. Every physical space is fully public access. The physical collections are interfiled using Dewey Decimal. The non-university going public are entitled to borrow university collections and vice versa. Staff at the Hive are formally employed by one or the other of the partners, but they aim for the kind of service experience to be indistinguishable. It was opened in 2012 and financed via a private finance initiative. So one of the pictures in the slide is of the sculpture that hangs in the entrance to the library. It's called the Kaleidoscope by Robert Orchardson. I think it's like a nice motif for the challenges and possibilities of the Hive, really. And the plaque next to the sculpture, which I only noticed after having walked past it for a year, basically, was really telling. So on the plaque it says, Orchardson was particularly struck by the library's guiding inspiration that learning and the attendant cultural processes of exploration, finding out, thinking, imagining, inventing and knowing are the province of all citizens and are to be nurtured and celebrated accordingly. The Hive, in these terms, he saw as a declaration of hope and possibility and a rare project of enlightenment at a time of national difficulty. So in terms of thinking about the practices of publicness in academic spaces, the Hive represents this really interesting test case, not only of kind of the extent to which these public academic collaborations work and questioning what working might look like, but also in the sense that it offers us this unusual view of the university general public interface, kind of brings into proximity a lot of processes that we kind of argue are happening across any city that has a university, but this is kind of pulling them all into one building. In contrast to this sort of staticness of the survey work and looking at policies and kind of stated intentions, the ethnographic methodology I followed was really about inhabiting the space, matching method with the sort of life of the space, and engaging with it over a long period of time in sort of different creative ways. And could talk about that more, but won't. So I'm just going to really pull out a few key themes as they relate to this idea of the public of the academic library. So most importantly, from spending a lot of time in the Hive, I came to understand that it was really an integrating library rather than a sort of completed integrated library. That might sound a bit cliche, but it really is a sort of space beyond the sum of its parts, and it illustrates the extent to which changing or subverting design and membership expectations recreates the possibilities of what is considered academic and public, and creates opportunities for sort of questioning that. These were sort of made live and through negotiation rather than being as static as we might expect them to be. Usage statistics confirmed that when given uncomplicated access, cross-borrowing was really popular. So between the university collections and the public collections, there was a lot of cross-borrowing between them. Interfiling the books also did something really interesting to the idea of public and academic knowledge classifications. So at the Hive, the interfiled books from each respective partner created this accidental silly archive, which is a theory borrowed from Jack Halberstam. I spent a lot of time in the 305 area, groups of people, and I'm just going to read a very short vignette from my thesis around this idea of the silly archive. So I see the Top Gear presenter, James May's How to Land an Airbus and Other Vital Skills for the Modern Man at 305.1/May, sitting alongside an edited academic collection called Constructing Masculinity, 305.31/Burr. The book, Why Men Can Only Do One Thing at a Time and Women Never Stop Talking, by Alan and Barbara Pease, 305.3/P, is tantalizingly in the same eye line as Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity by Judith Butler at 305.3/But. In The Queer Art of Failure, Jack Halberstam uses examples of so-called low culture, like SpongeBob SquarePants, as a way both to mobilize objects in queer history that would otherwise escape what they call large-scale accounts of alternative formation, and also to question the hierarchies of so-called high and low theory. They say, here we can think about low theory as a mode of accessibility, but we might also think of it as a kind of theoretical model that flies below the radar, that is assembled from eccentric texts and examples, and that refuses to confirm the hierarchies of knowing that maintain the high in high theory. So for Halberstam, the purpose of these unexpected encounters between high and low culture is to create a theory that mediates the childish, the transformative, and the queer. And I came to think, possibly by chance, that the Hive is contributing to this kind of beneficial destabilizing of narrow academic knowledge categories, while at the same time opening up the possibility for non-university going members of the public to enjoy texts not freely available to them. So in just seeing this on the bookshelves and out in the space of the library, there was this kind of playful subversion and questioning engagement made possible. And so really to sort of sum up, this bled out into the space as well. And what the Hive really offers is a managed surface upon which these live practices of public engagement with knowledge can take place. I think it's really significant that here, the direction of travel for this so-called public engagement is neither to sort of charitably pre-package academic knowledge and take it from the university out to this so-called public, nor was it to simply open up an academic space and allow this amorphous public in. Rather, going back to the Venn diagram at the beginning of the presentation, the Hive is sort of in the middle. It's this constantly integrating, evolving, fractious, convivial possibility. The Hive affords both conflict and negotiation, live and on the ground. It faces challenges in terms of mediating the ongoing asymmetry between the council budget and the university counterparts. Though imperfect, there is a sense that these conversations, negotiations, and even conflict have a productive capacity for recreating the public possibility of academia. Disparate values, experiences, attitudes, and entitlements did occasionally rub up against one another, and conviviality could give way to a kind of conflict. But ultimately, that too is productive and is a sort of testament to the enduring promise of a truly public education where these kind of boundaries can be safely explored. Oh, and so I'll pass over to Ben for some concluding remarks. Oh, Ben?
Hi, sorry, I was on mute. So just briefly, there's a conception that runs through not only the literature, but also the wording of policies of access, which is that the mission of academic libraries is more focused than that of public libraries. They serve the curricular and research needs of students, faculty, and staff of their parent institution, a seemingly uncontroversial statement. However, if we do think of the university as a public good and as enmeshed in relation to other public services, and if we think of these mentioned user groups as complex, multifaceted, and themselves embedded and bound in other relationships, then it becomes harder to justify such a narrow focus. In this final section, we'll briefly outline a number of different approaches to the question of what the community of the library is. When community is discussed in the literature, it tends to mean one of two things. The first is a sense of people with a similar formal position in relation to the institution, so students enrolled at the university or staff employed by it. Secondly, it can refer to those who live in the broader geographic conurbation in which the university sits. Here we will extremely briefly consider three models of community and how they might relate to public access to the library. First, the imagined community. This is a concept developed by Benedict Anderson in relation to a history of nationalism. An imagined community is formed in the minds of each member. This is developed by a complex interplay of media and political forces which seek to define and delimit groups of people by identity. For our purposes, we can see much of this impulse in the language of community in LIS. The community is something that is seemingly well-defined, which each member encouraged to think of themselves as such. A clear view of the library user, for example, emerges from library policy as someone who is a student living near the university, is a single person without dependents, is documented and housed. We can also think about the community in relation to the notion of inoperative community. This is a concept developed by Jean-Luc Nancy and taken up by the radical geographers J.K. Gibson Graham. Essentially, the idea is that unlike in the imagined community of the nation or the library, we want to develop communities that can't be put to nefarious uses, hence inoperative. Finally, we could think of the community in an intersectional manner. This is to use the term developed by Kimberly Crenshaw and often associated with feminism, to think about library users' many diverse positions and desires and identities. We can see move towards thinking about the community of the library in this way, in the move to information commons and learning centres, which aim to consider the whole student. So if just thinking about the community of the library ending at the campus, this allows us to trouble the settled understanding. So if we expand the notion of the student, we expand who we imagine to be the community of the library. We see the traditional community as sitting within and intimately connected to many others, and therefore we come to thinking about the role of the academic library as serving a more expansive set of people, as serving the public. So thanks very much. As mentioned, we're still sort of thinking about all this and would really welcome any comments and questions, I guess, in the water cooler, as it's now 3 o'clock. But also do feel free to get in touch with us about any of these topics.
Thank you very much, Ben and Katherine. That was a great presentation and absolutely perfectly to time. In fact, it's going to be me that takes us over now. But thank you so much for that. Really interesting work. And yeah, always love hearing about the Hive as well. And going to put out an early call to see if we can get hold of that full ethnographic paper, Katherine, for CALC 2022. We do have a breakdown. So we have